So you've got all this credibility, and the situation has changed, and you say, okay, we're going to try a serious peace initiative. But getting to that point, everybody had a problem, and everybody wanted all kinds of, assurances that were incompatible and so forth. And you, broadly speaking, the Arabs wanted a multilateral conference with substance. The Israelis wanted to do things bilaterally with very little substance. They didn't want to deal with a PLO period. And everyone was using the other's conditions as a reason why they didn't have to move.
That's correct. You're right.
Can you talk us through kind of how you orchestrated that?
What we did was, with respect to the PLO question, we talked to Palestinians from within the territories, not Palestinians in the diaspora in Tunis under Arafat. That was seen to be a terrorist organization at the time, and neither the Israelis nor we dealt with them. But we found Palestinians from within the territories who, of course, were taking their orders from Tunis, and we knew that, and the Israelis knew that. But it was a cutout, and it worked. That's how we got the Palestinians to the table with Israeli agreement. You mentioned one other thing. Everybody needed some sort of assurance or guarantee. So we actually gave letters of assurance to the various parties. And for the most part, those letters of assurance said the United States will not change its position on various issues, peace, settlements, whatever the various issues were. And we actually gave letters of assurance to each of the parties that we brought to Madrid and worked those letters out, and they were not conflicting. I mean, we made sure that they didn't conflict, and everybody got their letter of assurance. I'm not sure that the Israelis were ecstatic about coming to Madrid in the final analysis. I never will forget Shamir telling me, again, I only met with him one-on-one. We're sitting there, and we're on good terms personally. He looked at me, he said, what'd you give them? I said, I didn't give them anything, Mr. Prime Minister. He said, well, why do you think they're coming? They're changing 25 years of policy. I said, well, I think they're coming because they have made a strategic calculation to lean forward for peace. And I think they want to see whether or not there's any potential here for anything to happen. And they came. And Madrid I would argue that Madrid was a success. If for no other reason, then it broke that taboo. But that was a really hard one to put together. And I had a very adroit group of assistants at the State Department at the time who helped me with it, including Aaron David Miller and Dan Kurtzer and Dennis Ross and Bill Burns, who's now the Deputy Secretary of State. We had a great team, and we got it done. And most people didn't think that would ever happen. And it's, I've said before, and I'll say this here again, it's just a crime, a terrible shame that Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, because there was a government that leaned forward for peace in Israel, and he was a man of peace, and he could do it because he'd been the military hero in the wars against the Arabs, and he was a wonderful person, a great friend, and the world is worse off, the region's far worse off by virtue of the fact that he was assassinated. And I think had he lived, even though we were defeated for re-election, I think something still could have happened if Rabin had lived under the Clinton administration. But if George H.W. Bush had been re-elected with Yitzhak Rabin to work with, I really think we might have gotten something done, but that's all speculative. But the Madrid Peace Conference was a hard one to pull off because you really had a lot of moving parts. But when the Syrians said they would come, then that was
yeah, so it sounds like if you've got, the Saudis, the moderate Arabs, the Syrians say yes, and there's a PLO structure, for the Israelis to say no at that point's too hard.
They couldn't say no.
Yeah.
No,
so
they couldn't say no.
Kind of a coalition, a reluctant coalition you built.
That's right.
Nick, you had some.
Well, the Saudis were interesting too, because they wanted, they supported this idea, but then when the time came to say they'd come to the multilaterals, they didn't come as parties to the bilaterals. But I wanted them to come to the multilateral. And when the time came to get them to do it, I remember talking to King Fahd himself, and you know, he was very appreciative of what we had done in the Gulf with Iraq, because they were really fearful of Iraq. So I think that's one reason they made the decision to come to the multilaterals.
Nick? Secretary, on the Middle East, of course, this is the most complex part of the world. You had to reconcile and balance what we were saying privately to the Israelis with some very tough public messages. In fact, some of the toughest public messages we've ever given to the Israelis. At the AIPAC conference in 1989, you said, now it's time to...
That was before we tried to go to Madrid.
Right, to put aside the vision of a greater Israel.
Well, you know who wrote that, don't you? Dennis Roth. I told Dennis, I said, Dennis, here I am, a brand new Secretary of State, and you have me go to the AIPAC meeting and say, put aside the dream of a greater Israel. I said, how can you do this to a new Secretary of State?
But another time you gave the Israelis publicly the number of the White House switchboard.
Right.
So when
By the way, I gave that to everybody in the region. It was interpreted to mean the Israelis, because they were the ones at that time who were being very recalcitrant. And I said, look, tell our friends in the region when you get serious about peace to give us a call, and here's